Great. Let's get underway. Hello, my name is Jonathan Curtis, and welcome to today's webinar on the ACT Government's discussion paper on developing a new climate strategy. And we're coming to you today from, as you can probably see, the Conservation Council office, which is on Ngunnawal country. So the ACT Government released the discussion paper late last month for community consultation, and it follows an earlier round of, excuse me, consultation workshops. After reading it, I wasn't quite clear on what it's aiming to do. It doesn't really contain any particular targets or actions, something I imagine Simon will elaborate on. And it doesn't also set out any of the key choices. In short, it doesn't say what the government actually aims to do to combat climate change. I think I'm not the only one who's having that reaction. And in today's webinar, the Conservation Council's Executive Director, Dr. Simon Copeland, will be giving us a briefing on this discussion paper and talk about how the Conservation Council is going to be responding to it. He'll also provide some tips for any of you if you're considering putting in a submission. Simon, good morning. I don't think I can welcome you to a Conservation Council webinar since you're sitting nearby, but great to have you as a speaker rather than on my side of the microphone. In a moment, I'll pass to Simon for the briefing, which will go for about 30 minutes. But as we're going through, please do put any questions you have into the chat, and we expect to have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion after the briefing. So, Simon, over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today. What I'm just going to do is share my screen so I can share my slides for today. My voice is also just a little croaky today, so excuse me if I'm just needing to drink some water partway through. Just give me a second. Right, so we should be able to all see that. Is that loading? There we go. Can everybody see that all right? All right, so I'm just on the other screen. Sorry, folks, just yes, there we go. So hi, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country that we're meeting on today. We are meeting on Ngunnawal land here, but also pay respects to elders of all of the countries in this area, Ngunnawal, Ngambri, and Ngariyo people. We pay respects to elders past and present. And I always try and reflect on when we're talking about issues such as climate change, about how we incorporate Indigenous justice into the work that we do. And the ACT government's paper on this issue talks about justice and equity and well-being, but we are still not seeing heaps on how this can connect to Indigenous justice within this document. And I think that's something we need to do some work on here in the ACT Conservation Council. So keen to continue doing some of that work. Hang on one second. I'm just going to move my screen to here so I can actually see it a bit easier now. So what I'm going to be doing today is introducing you to the ACT government's climate change discussion paper, and then talk about, as Jonathan said, our response to this, give you some context for where it's come from, talk about our response to it, and talk about what we are going to be talking about in our submission to this document. And hopefully provide some tips and approaches for how you might want to do your own submissions. And we'll be sending out an email following this. Michael, do you have your hand up? Michael, do you have your hand up?
It's possible Michael is wanting to say that we can't see your slides.
It's moved. Hang on one second. Sorry, it's because I've moved it.
We've got your background.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, give me one second. I'll just do it again.
Yes, that was it.
All right, can you see them now? It's because I moved them onto a different screen.
Yes.
Otherwise, I was looking to the side when I was looking at the slides. Is that better?
Yes.
Apologies for that. All right, so let's start. So I want to provide you an introduction to the document and talk about how we're responding to it. So just a little bit of a background. So the ACT government has a climate change strategy 2019 to 2025. That has obviously now expired, and we don't have a new one. And the government didn't announce new funding to develop a new strategy until the last budget, which is the 25-26 budget. So they were already running pretty late. I think we all know that the ACT government has historically been a leader on climate action, and I think we should all be very proud of the work that we've done to get us to that place, particularly with having 100% renewable energy, shifting away from gas, having policies around electric vehicle uptake, for example, that are really important wins here in the community. In saying that, the government announced last year that we have not met our 2025 targets, emissions reduction targets, and not on track to meet net zero emissions. That announcement meant our target for 2025 was to reduce emissions by 50 to 60%. By that date, we reached the target of 47%. People will note we had already reached the target in 2024, but there were changes to accounting, particularly around land use, that meant we then went backwards, or that we weren't really meeting it in the first place. I think it's an obvious to state that against the backdrop of increasing global temperatures and extreme weather events, the government's developing this new strategy, and I think we'd all say that the time is to act is now, and that we really need to be outlining a credible pathway to reach net zero and reinstate the ACT as a world leader. And I think the framework of the position we're in which we're not meeting our targets really suggests a need to be pushing harder. And as Jonathan has already outlined in his introduction, there are some real concerns about this paper that it's not really pushing harder, it's just kind of restating some of the things that we're already doing. So just a bit of overall analysis of this document. So the document is, and I even wrote in there, it's a strategy, it's a discussion paper. It's a discussion paper that presents a framework, what the minister calls a framework for how we're going to do climate action into the future. And what it really does is outline 8 key areas of work in which we will be doing some action. What I would argue is it presents no real vision to how we get to net zero. This reflects the fact that the government took no new climate policies to the 2024 ACT elections. So the Labor Party at that election took its climate policies were to maintain the Sustainable Household Scheme and to have no backward steps on any of the current climate policies. But they took no new ideas, no new things to the electorate. And this is reflected in this discussion paper where there is really nothing new that they are taking forward to help us reduce our emissions. And I think that really isn't good enough, particularly in the context in which we're not meeting our targets and which we've been told we're unlikely to meet a net zero target. The government, and particular the minister, and anyone who has listened to the minister on this, has also consistently framed this and has done this to me personally, that the community, we're entering into the stage of needing to do harder things to reduce emissions, and that the community will need to, quote unquote, do more to reduce emissions. And my concern, and I think the concern of many, is that we're seeing a potential blame shift, a shift towards saying to the community, you need to step up to do more. But at the same time, the ACT government isn't doing that stepping up themselves by talking about the more that they're going to be doing. And there are real risks associated with this. So if we look at transport, for example, transport is our biggest emitter, now direct emitter in the ACT, over 61% of emissions coming from transport, and that is rising. We can tell people that they need to catch a bus until our face goes blue. We can tell people that they need to buy electric vehicles until our face goes blue. But if we don't have a good enough bus network, or if it's still too expensive for people to buy these vehicles, people aren't going to do it. And if we keep saying it without investing more, what we're actually going to do is shift blame to the community. And then the community is going to feel that blame, and they're going to just want to retreat from doing climate action, and it's not going to bring people along the way. So telling the community to do more without stepping up themselves is a real risk for the government. To give you a bit of an idea of how this paper is written, this is a little section that I highlighted. This is under the government section. So as I said, each section is they identify 8 different areas of work, and we'll go through those sections in a minute. And each section has a little background of what they're doing, and then what a section called proposed new steps. I took a photo of this one after I'd underlined it throughout my reading of the document, because you can see the kinds of words that the government is using here, which is really is a way to ensure that they say that they don't do anything. So in this one, under the government section, they talk about how they will continue to investigate, they'll continue exploring options that they could consider, they'll explore, they'll exploring, they'll continue, they'll seek to improve, or they'll explore further opportunities. Now, if you have read government documents, if you've read government strategies, which I have done too many times, you'll know that these are the kinds of words that governments like to use to not commit to anything, to say, we'll look at doing something, but we won't actually necessarily do it. And in the context of climate change, in the context of this document, you see this language quite a lot, where this language of exploring or continuing or considering is repeated over and over again. And it's a way to say, we're not actually committing to these things. We'll just look at see whether they might be viable in the future. And that's a worry. In the context of climate change, we know that we need to be doing things and we need to be taking some risks and we need to be doing things quickly. We cannot waste more time on the government continuing to explore things that we know have been working in other parts of the world. But this document is full of these types of approaches, and I think that sort of speaks to where the government is at the moment on this issue. So I want to go through all of the different sections that the government has been talking about in this paper and talk about what they're saying and then also how we are responding to it. So the first thing, so as I said, there's 8 different sections that the government is talking about in this document, but they have an overarching framework, which they're calling equity, resilience, and wellbeing. And they're arguing, or they're saying that the future climate strategy needs to be based within these ideas, that everything should reflect an intention to embed equity, wellbeing, and resilience as key pillars of the ACT's net zero transition. So what that means is that these 3 things will inform all of their action areas, and that's kind of an important part of what they're thinking about. Now, we think that this is actually really valuable. We think that equity is one thing that's often lost in climate discussions, as well as resilience. So there is an importance in naming this and making this an overarching theme of the document. In saying this, there's no concrete details on the actions the ACT government will take to deal with this issue. And we're also concerned because disaster resilience has been downgraded as a key action area to a subset of a broader equity theme. And disaster resilience is a really core issue. Particularly, we can see this in this past few months where we've had heat waves, storms, big floods, and that's a real core concern that we're kind of downgrading this to a key action area and a subset rather than it being its own specific area. And again, we're seeing some of the framing of resilience in discussion paper places responsibility onto individuals and shifts focus away from the government. So what are we going to be asking for and specifically talking about in this particular theme? First, that the ACT government's establish an extreme weather resilience team to coordinate government, business and community preparedness efforts. So ensuring that there is still a focus on extreme weather resilience to prioritise the health and safety of all community members during extreme weather events. We want to improve energy efficiency and climate resilience in public facilities. So really embedding resilience into our city. But we think that there's some other components of equity that are also being missing, and equity will have to be doing stuff in equity around social justice and ensuring equity for people who are lower socioeconomic parts of our community. And I think that's been a big concern about some of the major policies. So the Sustainable Household Scheme, for example, is still really only accessible to those who are wealthy enough to be able to pay back those payments. So how can we ensure that we're not missing out people in those payments? But I think another area that is missing is the issue of intergenerational equity. And in line with the International Court of Justice's 2025 landmark advisory opinion on climate change, which says that there needs to be intergenerational equity in everything that we do, that we need to be embedding this into our work, and this is not really being discussed at all within this framework at this point in time. So let's get on to the specific, sorry, go back. Oh no, I'm going forward. Let's get on to the specific areas in which the government has framed as its core 8 areas. So the first 8 of these 8 areas is energy. So the government's discussion paper outlines an intention to continue to invest in transitioning away from fossil fuels and maintain the ACT government's 100% renewable energy supply, ensure grid resilience through battery storage, support new technologies to accelerate the energy transition through the Energy Innovation Fund, and support workers impacted by the transition. So what they're doing here is maintaining a commitment to continue doing all that they have been doing on energy, which is important. It's very important that we maintain 100% renewable energy. And we have seen some good projects such as the Canberra Big Battery Project and good investment in batteries as a next step towards our energy transition. But we argue that maintaining current investment and policy settings will not be sufficient to meet legislated emissions reductions targets, and that we need to be doing more. And that structural barriers remain to accelerating the energy transition. For example, renters, small business leasing spaces are currently often find it very difficult to modify the places they lease and to switch to renewable energy or to switch off gas. And more work needs to be done to support these communities to be shifting their energy. And those are the groups that are often left behind. So what are we asking for? In energy, we're going to be asking for a more ambitious strategy with higher investment, more support for innovation and building capacity of gas-based workers to retrain. We want to bring forward the commitment to phase out gas by 5 years to 2040 and invest in accelerating electrification by expanding the Home Energy Support Program to directly fund electrification for home, low income and vulnerable households. And this is really important. We have what I would call a missing middle group of people who often kind of access new electrification. So people who can access the sustainable household scheme who are wealthier are transitioning away from gas. We do have a program of transitioning public housing away from gas. But low income and vulnerable households can often struggle. And so expanding the home energy support program to directly fund electrification is going to be really important. We think we need to strengthen minimum efficiency standards to require all rental homes to meet 7 stars by 2035. We need to fund the electrification of all government assets, including social housing, schools, and community centres. And that is happening, but it needs to be happening faster and do more work to increase the uptake of solar power, battery, and energy monitoring systems. The next section is on natural environment. And this is an interesting one that sort of feels in some ways a little added on to the strategy. Natural environment obviously plays a core role in climate adaptation as well as climate mitigation. We know that land use has a big impact on climate and climate mitigation, climate emissions. But at the moment, this natural environment one feels like the climate policy team have gone to the environment team and just grabbed what they're currently doing and sort of put it into the document. And it's not necessarily thinking about it through that climate lens. Even though I will say a lot of the team in the natural environment team, the Office for Nature Conservation, are thinking about climate change in some ways more proactively than elements of the climate team and government might be. So, I mean, that's in relation to natural environment, that is. Language in this section is vague and adds little to current policy. It says things like planting more trees and plants and improving waterways. The discussion paper fails to address the ACT is not on track to meet its target of 30% canopy cover by 2045. And in fact, our canopy cover is going backwards at this point in time. And cancelling plans to renaturalise Sullivan's Creek alongside not investing in new waterway projects represent a step backwards to improving our waterways. And we still have an issue in that trees protected under the Tree Protection Act or the Urban Forest Act are still being removed. And the government is not accounting for tree loss under heat stress in a hotter climate. So we have issues around adaptation for trees and that we're losing trees due to heat stress in very hot days. And we need to be thinking about how do we plant heat and drought resistant species. So R asks, I mean, this climate strategy has been released at the same time as the nature conservation strategy, which includes the development of a nature conservation network to protect our biodiversity from beyond formal protected areas. If you're interested in that particular issue, we're having a similar webinar this time next week on the nature conservation strategy. So I won't go into depth about that now. But what we're saying is that strategy is good. It's very aspirational, and what we need is that to be properly funded and resourced to make sure it happens. And we need to improve and properly resource management of waterways, including enforcing a water-sensitive urban design guidelines as compulsory for all urban developments, further incorporating First Nations practices into management of urban lakes and waterways, providing secure ongoing funding to community groups working on catchment management, water quality testing, ecological surveys, and public education and engagement, and progressively upgrading and renaturalising existing major creeks and stormwater channels. You may have also seen that there's been a particular debate about renaturalisation following the flood in Woden a couple of weeks ago and the significant damage done to Yarralumla Creek, which is a stormwater drainage drain at the moment. And so I think that renaturalisation debate is going to continue. Transport. Transport is in the ACT becoming one of, if not the biggest issue when it comes to climate change and carbon emissions. So transport is the ACT's biggest source of direct carbon emissions, 61% of our total emissions now. That means emissions that are the pollution that happens within our borders, with the majority of this coming from private vehicles. We know, and the ACT government has said this many times, that we cannot get to net zero with a simple like-for-like transition of petrol vehicles to low emissions vehicles. And that's in part because even when we have a ban on new sales, there's going to be ongoing petrol cars coming from interstate, as well as the fact that people will hold on to their petrol cars until their end of life. So we need to be seeing transition not just to electric vehicles, but transition of people out of private vehicles, and that means into public and active transport. The ACT Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory report reports no downward trend in ground transport emissions. We're seeing very little actual success in this area. And our current public transport and active transport network is not fit for purpose. It's unreliable, slow, patchy, and expensive. And I think we've seen this recently with further cuts to areas in West Belconnen, for example, following bridge works, despite promises that from the ACT government that they would increase services. And I think really importantly, the discussion paper, while it talks about the importance of transport, it makes no tangible commitments towards timelines or funding for sustainable and active transport. It just sort of says we'll continue doing the policies we've already got, which are policies that are just clearly not working. We have lots of asks when it comes to transport, and we have a whole transport section of our policy platform from the 2024 ACT election. And I'll just go through a few of these. There are actually more. One is the first one is to fund and implement an integrated transport strategy for Canberra that prioritises moving people safely, protects the environments, drives down emissions, and maintains livability and equity of access. To really deliver an integrated and electrified bus and light rail network with a frequent, reliable 7-day service, with particular emphasis on accelerating light rail construction, which is going very slowly. Legislate a target of 50% of all commuting journeys by active and public transport to be as a target by 2035. Upgrade and build the missing links in our active travel network, which is the government has already identified in its own active travel plan. They have a map of new links. They should just be building them. Commit to all buses operating 100% renewable energy by 2035. There has been issues with the rollout of the electrification of our bus fleet, and I think there needs to be more speeding up and making sure that happens. Implement vehicle registration regulations that preference small zero-emission vehicles. We have an issue. The ACT government did release new registration regulations a couple of years ago, which prioritise zero-emissions vehicles. But if you have a very heavy zero-emissions vehicle, you get a cheaper registration, and there's some issues around safety and costs and impact of construction of those building of those vehicles, which isn't taken into account. and to do things like expand a slower streets program and implement design changes to calm suburban streets, which will encourage the uptake of active travel. And one final one is offer incentives to purchase bicycles, scooters, both manual and electric, particularly to replace car ownership. And one of the things that we have at the moment is that if you want to buy an expensive electric vehicle, you can get a $15,000 loan from the government to do so. That's a no interest loan to do so. If you want to buy an electric bike, which can be a replacement for a car, and is a replacement for a car, you have no access to any sort of support from the ACT government to do so. And we've heard internally that that's because the Chief Minister thinks that bikes are a recreation tool and not a commuter tool. And therefore, it wouldn't be replacing like for like, whereas we know people want to get onto bikes and use electric bikes to replace their vehicles. And so we're encouraging that there should be incentives such as electric bikes should be available on the Sustainable Household Scheme. Built environment. So this is obviously looking at our city and how our city adapts and responds to climate change. So the population of the ACT is growing with an estimated population of 560,000 people by 2035 and 681,000 by 2050. The discussion in that paper outlines the need for holistic consideration of the built and natural environments with our water, energy, and transport systems. It talks about nature-based solutions, improving how buildings communicate with and respond to electric grid in real time, and reducing embodied emissions in construction through promoting the use of low carbon materials and adaptive reuse. Some really good ideas here, but again, no real commitments to how that will be implemented. What we're asking for here is the new strategy should include tangible measures to improve the resilience and adaptive capacity of the built environment. This is particularly relevant given the missing middle changes here in the ACT, in which we're going to see the development of new townhouses, small apartment buildings, etc., and they need to have tangible measures to improve their resilience and adaptive capacity. And we need to identify and mandate simple yet effective ways to make houses climate resilient during winter and summer. Draft ceiling, topping up ceiling insulation, filling around windows, skirting boards and doors, and financially supporting low and income households to do so. Other emissions. The government has a section that they just call other emissions, which is just the catch-all for everything else they couldn't really capture in their document. So other emissions include waste, FOGO, food, organics and garden organics, waste, aviation, and scope 3 emissions. Just worth noting that FOGO, food organics and garden organics rollout is already years behind schedule in the ACT. So most of us don't have a green bin for our food organics and garden organics. This is despite other cities around the country and rural towns in our area being able to manage this. We have not been able to manage it here in the ACT. Scope 3 emissions are emissions that happen outside our borders. So, for example, the emissions of all the items that we purchase. And if you take into account Scope 3 emissions in the ACT, they account for 93% of our total emissions, yet they're very consistently downplayed. And there are some recommendations that the government should be following to sort of incorporate Scope 3 emissions into our thinking. And one other thing that they don't talk about at all is wood fire heaters in the strategy, both in regards to the direct emissions, which are minimal but have a big impact on people's health, but also the impact on local native forests, which act as carbon sinks, and the impact of cutting those down, the biodiversity impact of cutting those down, I meant to say. So our asks there is to implement all recommendations by the Office of the Commissioner of Sustainability and the Environment for reducing Scope 3 emissions. The previous Commissioner did an excellent report on Scope 3 emissions, and there are some great recommendations that the government could just adopt. To scale up the delivery of the FOGO pilot and program and expand the service to additional suburbs, and then to really roll it out, to speed up rollout to the rest of the city. And to maintain a commitment to the phase out of wood fire heaters, which the Labor government has slowly and quietly backtracked on, is doing really no work on a phase out. So there is a commitment to a phase out of wood fire heaters, but there's really very little being done, and it's unlikely that it will be achieved. The next section is on government. So what the government itself can do to reduce emissions. The discussion talks about managing climate risks to its own operations and assets, supporting community resilience, and reducing its operational emissions. The government intends to achieve a net zero emission target for itself by 2040. So all government operations should be net zero by 2040 through exploring options to strengthen emissions measurement, adaptation planning, and climate risk. Consider how climate change impacts and risks might be more effectively evaluated in government investment and planning decisions, exploring co-benefits, and seeking to improve transparency and accountability. And you can see the weasel language there of exploring, seeking to improve, considering, etc., in this part of the document. Our ask, again, is tangible, accountable measures for them to publish carbon footprints report of and climate risk assessment related to government assets and operations, and to establish a permanent dedicated government's entity responsible for climate risk assessment, emission accounting, monitoring and reporting, and cross-sectoral cooperation across government directorates. And that cross-sectoral cooperation is really important. It sounds really dull, but often when it comes to these issues, people in the climate team work on something, but everybody else in government doesn't get that sense. But we think that climate needs to run across all of government, particularly when we're talking about reducing emissions within government agencies. And I think more work can be done to spread this to what they would sort of socialize this amongst socialize these policies amongst all elements of government. So that's the 8 sections. I'm just going to finish up here, and I think that's just me over about 30 minutes. There's kind of our initial thinking about this. The Conservation Council will be doing a submission of our own, but we're also encouraging you to have your say to make a submission to the ACT government on this really important issue. We think that the core message is that the strategy must be accompanied by clear actions and tangible goals in each of these identified areas. You can make a submission before the 18th of March 2026 via the ACT Government's Your Say platform or by emailing your written comments to climatechange@act.gov.au. But we're also going to be putting out a submission guide, which will come out this week, hopefully, which will provide you with tips for writing your submission and key points to include. So if you don't want to spend all the time doing your own research, but want to still put in a submission to make some of the points that I've made today, we'll have a template and some suggestions of points that you can make to put in your own submission. Submissions don't have to be long. They don't have to be in-depth. Sometimes shorter submissions are better if you can get across your point. So I think that we're really encouraging the more submissions there are in, the government really takes notice of how many submissions are put in, and they will take notice of what the community feedback is. So we really encourage you to put in a submission. So I think that's the end of my presentation. What I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and then I'm really happy to take questions and encourage some discussion.
Thanks, Simon. That was really interesting. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and which Simon also has access to, of course, and I'll put them to Simon. While you're thinking and typing, a couple of questions from me, Simon. The first one is, what do we know about the reasons for why the ACT has not met its targets? You touched on this briefly at the beginning, and you mentioned land use as one of them, for example, but can you explore that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's still a little confusing, but basically, they do an update every year. And in 2024, they announced that I think we were at 50%. So it was kind of great to have met our 2025 targets a year early. And they use an independent experts to do the measuring of this. And when we found out that we weren't meeting our targets, we were a bit unsure about what it doesn't mean emissions have gone up, or does it mean we've changed our accounting? And it seems that what's happened is that we've changed the accounting has changed, and it's primarily around how we measure land use changes. We do have a lot of land use changes going on in the ACT, construction, suburb development that has emissions impact in terms of trees being cut down, habitat being destroyed. And it seems like that has had an impact on how we've accounted for emissions. Now, I'm not an expert in this, so I don't have all the details, but that is what we understand to be the shift. It's not that our emissions have gone up in some of the core areas that we're working on. For example, energy, transport, it hasn't gone up, but it hasn't gone down very much. we're not sort of seeing a massive uptake in these emissions. We're just seeing changes in how we report it. But what it probably shows is that we've just generally not been actually meeting our targets in the first place.
I noticed Tony's thrown a good question. Why do you think the government has lost energy on this topic, given that we have gone from some fairly a really quite ambitious government position, which led to some really good results? What's changed?
It's a good question, Tony. And it's one that I can't give you a full answer to. I do think the government possibly feels that and you can hear this in the way that the minister talks about this issue. Minister Orr feels that we've achieved the easy things, not that any of it is easy, and that there's fear about how to do the more difficult stuff. So the minister talked in our town hall last week. She talked about the fact that when it comes to changing your energy, for example, from coal to renewables, people can still turn the lights on, people can still use their energy. But when it comes to changing people's transport behaviours, it requires quote unquote more of the community. And I think that this government is generally, and I've experienced this in a range of areas, is generally actually pretty timid government. Uh, Quite conservative in the sense that they don't want to take risks. And so asking the community to do big things is something that they're worried about doing. I think that's part of it. I mean, we've also had a shift in the governance arrangements, where we now have a Labor-only government, and that may speak to some of the priorities in which they're placing. I think the final one is that we have a dominance now of the housing debate and a real focus on housing construction from the government, and that is being prioritized over everything. And it's very important that housing is prioritised, but I think that there's some real risks that what's happening there is they're saying we want to build cheap, easy houses. And so things like ensuring that they're climate ready are not important. And that's a real worry that what we're going to be having is 30,000 new homes that are terribly built and that won't be sustainable for people into the future.
Yeah, that would seem to be a very high risk that in the enthusiasm for knocking up buildings, the emissions from building all those roads and new buildings alone is huge.
Yeah.
Katie asked the other good question: how well does the government actually implement its own policies, for example, in development and planning approvals?
Oh, good question, Katie. And often we find that that's very poorly is in fact the case. And we have this issue if we talk about the natural environment section or the built environment section. The government has, for example, as part of the new planning and the new planning system that they developed a couple of years ago, they developed a range of design guides. So there's the biodiversity sensitive urban design guide. There's also the water sensitive urban design guide. They have a new active travel design guide, which should all influence how people are building this type of infrastructure. But we see that even the government doesn't follow its own design guides. And so they'll put out a guide there, but none of them are mandatory. And so they've ended up being really shiny, nice, pretty documents that exist on a website that nobody's really following. And we see this happening over and over again. And there are just really poor practices in a way that we're constructing a lot of things. And it's a real concern. And so I think it has a concern both for our natural environment that we're seeing that we can consistently see developers chipping away at our natural environment and having a real impact on our biodiversity. But then again, constructing and building things that are really poor for a climate future, both in terms of still continuing to build buildings that require higher levels of energy and that aren't really well designed, and that are also just not adapted for a future climate. And so, yeah, the government is often not very good at implementing its own policies, particularly around planning.
As part of the discussion papers sort of implicit shift in pushing responsibility onto the community, it begs the question, what do we know about the community's attitudes to tackling climate change as an urgent issue. Do you think that what we're also seeing from government is a community itself that has displaced climate change as an issue relative to housing and cost of living? And so their sense politically is that this is just not a big issue for them at the moment.
Yeah, I think we are seeing nationally a bit of a dip in energy around climate change, which is a real worry. That at least the politicians and maybe that's reflected in the community are not taking it as seriously or as urgent as an issue. And I've noticed this with climate change that it does, like any issue, it does fluctuate in terms of the energy it's given. It's a real disappointment that we're not getting the COP meeting next year, because I think that would have really highlighted, I don't think it would have achieved much, but it would have really highlighted the importance of the issue here in Australia and would have made it a media storm again. But that's not happening. But I think that's a real risk. But in saying that, in the ACT, consistent polling has shown that people take this issue very seriously. They support these actions. The government is again very risk averse, but we've actually taken some very bold steps in the past, and the government has not been punished for it. There have been general broad support for it. So I think that the community is often looking for leadership on these issues, and sometimes a government has to step out and take that leadership, and we're not seeing that at this point in time.
Yeah. The next question is from Gordon, and this touches back on the missing middle. I know in the missing middle discussion, some of the concerns seem to focus on multi-residence developments getting rid of all the gardens. But as Gordon points out, the biggest threat, just on my observation, seems to be McMansions being built everywhere, covering the entire, well, pretty much 90% of the block. What can we do to push for increased development charges based on the size of houses to discourage this? Has that been
Yeah.
looked at?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. I think that's a good idea and one we should be investigating, and whether that is a potential idea or something that can discourage exactly what you're talking about, which is a knockdown rebuild of a small house on a block with plenty of trees in the backyard that gets replaced with something that is almost 90% concrete. We are supposed to have again uh, permeable surface requirements in blocks. I don't know honestly about how well those are enforced to ensure that not everything is concrete. We're supposed to have tree canopy requirements as well, and I don't know how well those are enforced. I think you're right, though, Jonathan. You say that this is often the bigger risk compared to the development of townhouses or apartment blocks. There is a lot of concern about the loss of sort of private gardens or trees in townhouses with the construction of new townhouses and apartment blocks. I think that if they're designed well, and that's a big if, that can be ameliorated in that sense. So if you go overseas, if you go to places like Europe, a lot of great apartment blocks, they might have big apartment blocks that can suit many people, but you have big courtyards in the middle that have lots of trees in them. They have setbacks from the verge, so you still have lots of trees. It can be done really well, but I do have concern that the government again is going to go for the cheap and easy option. So encourage developers to do it cheaply, which will mean lots of concrete and not many trees.
Yeah. Real asks, do you think the EPBC reforms of just the last, 6 months, will help, particularly the stronger biodiversity approval requirements, resulting in hopefully less environmental impacts?
Yeah, so I think that there are some good things that came out of those EPBC reforms. There are some important things. The development of national standards for the environment is going to be really important. Implementation of that is going to be really key, because it's again very broad. For example, it sets out that we have to have national standards for environmental protection, but it doesn't. They're going through steps now to develop those standards, and so what they actually look like, what the regulations that are used to back that up, will be really integral. I think that there's real potentials here, but there's also some real risks. One of the things that I will say is a real risk, it doesn't really impact the ACT so much, is that the new EPBC reforms make it potentially easier for the federal government to hand over powers back to the states. So to hand over approval powers back to the states to do so. Now in the ACT, that's not a big issue. I don't think the ACT government is particularly keen to be doing assessments on federal environmental issues. But we know that, for example, the West Australian government is very keen, and there are already active negotiations around how to do that. And that could mean that you could have a West Australian and Northern Territory government, which are in the pockets of big fossil fuel companies, potentially having more power to make those decisions. And that's a real worry. So there's going to be some national work that needs to be done to really resist that handing back of power. And that's something that we're really concerned about in regards to those new EPBC laws.
With the in the context of the ACT government's budget constraints, it obviously leads to the need to be fairly selective from a government perspective, selective in where they spend the money. And what do we know about what gets the best bang for the buck? There's in terms of results for climate activities, it's one of the big things that's left out of the discussion paper is what's worked well in the past.
It's a good question, Jonathan, and I don't have a full answer for you on that in terms of what we know is the best bang for buck for things into the future. One of the challenges we have here is that some of the things that we do need to do are going to be tricky and will take a bit of work. So one of the issues we know we're facing, for example, is how do you transition existing apartment blocks and townhouse complex from gas to electric? And there will be investment that's required into that. And so I can see the government thinking maybe that's not the best bang for buck because one apartment block or townhouse compared to doing other things is going to be not worth it. But I think we need to be thinking very seriously about what's the overall budget picture and the best bang for buck in the overall budget picture. I think that's going to be really important. The some areas where we can be talking about this really actively is looking at government choices, particularly around things like transport. So we know that the government spends a lot of money on roads and road redevelopment here in the ACT. At the moment, they're doing a flyover at Monero Highway. They're duplicating William Hobble Drive. They're duplicating Athlone Drive. Each of those projects costs over $100 million each. Around about and having significant environmental impacts too with the loss of trees, things like that. So there are government choices that can be made. Now, if all of that money was invested into a public transport system and into new bike paths and new footpaths, we could see a much bigger bang for buck in terms of reduction of emissions, in terms of the impact on people's, people shifting away from private vehicles. So I think that there are choices that the government are making which we should be challenging and thinking about and saying if you want to be serious about climate change, you need to make different choices.
It seems to me, and this is something we've spoken about, I think, Simon, that often when they do choose to do, for example, the the bike paths that they do put in are magnificent creatures. They're exquisite. They're separated. They're lovely, but they must be terribly expensive. In preference, seemingly to much quicker, simpler retrofitting through segregated lanes on existing roads. It seems that
Yeah.
Canberra's roads are really very wide, and
Yeah.
you could simply insert bike lanes into it seems to me those many of those roads in the
Well,
way they
one of
did just on near the just on the near the National Gallery area
yeah.
leading to Kingston. They simply put a division down one side. They closed a lane, and yeah, bang, you've got yourself a bike path.
Yeah, and that is something that other cities, particularly in COVID-19, they did out really quickly. It was a stimulus project to
Mm.
roll out. It happened in Sydney, roll out pop-up bike lanes. They were good for people to get around. And the ACT didn't do that. And when I was back in my old job at Pedal Power, we're advocating for that to happen. They're really cheap, they're easy, but the government was very nervous, very timid about doing so. The one that they did in Kingston, near the gallery there, it took them 10 months to plan this one bike lane. Now, the idea is that they shouldn't they shouldn't require that. They should be pop up. You should test them. You should put them out. If people don't like them, you can take them out. But the government still, and that one was installed a couple of years ago, and now we've seen no more go up. So they're missing out on opportunities to do things that could have real impact, and they're not doing it because of their timid approach to things.
Yeah. Ruth asks a couple of questions. She points quite correctly to the need for actually stronger climate change ambition, given that climate change is happening faster than forecast and the climate sensitivity is greater than was known. Should we be advocating for education strategies and building greater engagement with the community so that people understand why this is a near-term issue, not a long-term one?
Yeah, so just on that first question, Ruth, yes, our position is that the net zero target should be brought forward by 5 years to 2040. And so we'll be advocating for that in our submission on this discussion paper, and we encourage others to do the same. I think Kathy also right at the top had a question about education. What about education communication strategies? And I think that yes, we agree that there should be ongoing engagement with the community around these issues. I don't think we need to have education for this community about what climate change is. I think the Canberra community understands that, and we don't want to get built sort of into the depths of what the science is. Although I think we'll probably need to be talking more education about the further disasters and increased extremes that we're going to see. But I do think education around how do we bring people along on these issues is going to be really important. And you'll hear the minister say that that's going to be really important. We have to bring people along. We don't want to lose social license for this type of stuff. We don't want to put people off. And I think that is important to an extent, but that doesn't mean you have to be timid. You can bring people along by trying things. You can bring people along by doing the things and then getting their feedback. What we often see the government say is we don't want to do this because we don't know if the community's on board, but you have to sometimes do those things and educate them as you're doing them, and then people will adopt and adapt them as you go along. So I think education is really important. I think there are ways we can do that. Ruth, you mentioned, for example, citizens' assemblies and citizen juries on other topics. That could be one way to do that. I think there are other options as well. So I think that education has to be really core to it. And the government is not really doing that. They're talking about how we have to bring that it's important to do this, but they're not actually taking the leadership that's necessary to make it happen.
We've only got time for a couple more questions, but Rill asks, would it help to support more people to work from home to reduce emissions? It's an interesting point about how much, uh, what percentage of transport emissions come from commuting for work purposes.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't actually know about the emissions directly to commuting and whether working from home would be a solution to that. I think there are benefits, obviously, to working from home. I'm not going to go into all of the benefits and negatives of it, but I think that those kinds of things can be valuable. I mean, I think that also one of the things we should be careful of is that when we start to think about scope 3 emissions and things like aviation emissions, one of the bigger issues is actually not necessarily someone hopping on the tram to come into the city to work from an office, but it's often people in big corporations flying to Brisbane for the meeting that they could have on Zoom. It's often these kinds of things, people flying around to get their corporate gifts, these kinds of things. When we talk about those kinds of emissions, that's the stuff that has a bigger impact than this. So we're really careful of not blaming regular workers, but instead be looking at those who are really often using their wealth to rack up emissions. So I think there's some value in doing stuff about encouraging people to work from home, as long as we don't do it in a kind of blaming kind of way. Jonathan, actually, on that, I think you missed a question right at the top from John that I wouldn't mind answering if that's all right, which is
Yeah,
about
I just spotted that. That was about AI data
yeah,
centers.
yeah. So John, thanks for that question about AI data centers because they use a lot of energy. We know that they use a lot of energy and a lot of water. One of the things here in the ACT that we have been concerned about at the Cons Council is that the ACT is being spoken about as a potential great venue for data centers because of our climate. The ACT government has people who are working on this issue, and there actually are some proposals for data centers here. That could have an impact on our grid, particularly on a renewable energy grid. Would definitely have an impact on our water sources. We're doing some work to develop more policies around AI data centers and the impacts they have. I don't have that for us just yet, except to say that we should. I agree with you, John, that they need to have their own renewable energy supplies, and they should be really, if they're going to use more energy, they should be adding to our grid, not taking away from it. And we really need to be doing some discussion about the impacts that would have on water and whether we actually have the water supplies to make that happen, to make them feasible. In the US, there have been literal examples of rivers running dry, people not being able to access water because it's all being taken up by data centers, and we do not want to see that here.
No, it's given the forecast for increasing dryness in our region, that would seem to be about the last thing we would be wanting to do.
Yeah.
Well, that pretty much takes us to the end of our time for today. Simon, thanks again for the briefing. Really, really interesting and comprehensive. And notwithstanding that I'd read the document, I got a lot out of your summarisation and framing of it. Thanks to everyone who joined us online and some really good questions. And apologies if I missed any. Some of the best questions I've seen in a webinar actually, which made my job really easy. It did mean I didn't get to ask a lot of mine, but that's life. So we'll wrap up there. I hope to see you all for our next webinar. As Simon mentioned, we've got one on the 4th of March coming up very quickly, which is looking at the ACT government's nature conservation strategies. So that should be a really good one as well. You'll be able to find details of how to register for that, of course, on the website or in the Yellow Box newsletter that I imagine you will get. So on that note, have a great day and see you next time.